It's really my pleasure to introduce Amy Marcus of the Wall Street Journal and ask her to introduce in more depth the panel that she has online. Amy is a staff reporter. She covers health, medicine, and science, and she was awarded the 2005 Pulitzer Prize for beat reporting for a series of stories about cancer, and in 2017 she also received a Master's of Bioethics degree from Harvard Medical School. Thanks, Amy.
So good morning, everyone. It's really nice to see such a large audience, especially for such an important conversation. I don't like to speak for other people, so I'm actually going to let my panel to please introduce themselves, and then we'll start the conversation.
I'm Klaus Martins. Mary Howell, my wife and I are organic farmers. We farm 1,600 acres of about 30 different crops. We farm in New York. We started out as conventional farmers. We farmed for 20 years using conventional techniques like the land-grant universities taught us. It worked well, except that we couldn't make any money at it. And we decided to try something different. And at the time we made the switch, there really was no good place to go to for learning how to farm organically. So we worked very closely with Cornell in developing systems that would work. I'm on the Organic Farming Research Foundation Board of Directors. I'm a member of Farm Foundation and on the board of Farm Foundation. And Bill Buckner and I have worked together to form the Soil Health Institute. And I'm on the board of the Soil Health Institute.
Thanks. Jackie?
I'm Jackie Leach-Scully. I'm Professor of Social Ethics and Bioethics at Newcastle University, UK. I'm also a disability activist, and I specialize in bioethics of disability throughout my career, as well as reproductive and genetic medicine. I started out originally as a molecular biologist, but then I drifted. I am not rudely reading the Boston Globe as we go along, but because I'm actually very deaf, I'm reading the transcript, which is coming off the CART transcriber there.
Hello, my name is Remisa Mashumba. I'm a farmer from Zimbabwe. I run an organization also called Munandi Africa, which works at supporting rural farmers to access technology in agriculture. I'm a conventional farmer, and yeah, very interested on this topic and how it affects us as farmers.
Hi, my name is Melissa Buffalo, and I'm an enrolled member of the Meskwaki Nation in Iowa. I am the lead for the Community Engagement Innovation Division with the Collaborative Research Center for American Indian Health out of South Dakota. Thank you.
Last but not least.
Good morning, Kent Redford. I'm a conservation biologist and conservation practitioner. Started in the university and then spent 20 years in the NGO world. And I'm now operating on my own out of Portland, Maine. I'm also here because I'm chairing the Task Force on Synthetic Biology and Conservation, which was put in place by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. So we're developing an assessment and then I'm making a policy recommendation for the IUCN World Congress, which will be held in 2020. Thank you.
So thank you all. Melissa, I'm going to start with you with the first question, and there's a particular reason why. And that's because when we talk about CRISPR and gene editing, we're really talking about the potential in the future and what in the research we're doing now. And yet you've said that understanding history is also important, and that we really can't move forward until we understand what happened to various groups in the past. Could you talk a little bit about that through the prism of your experience with tribal communities, please?
Yep. So not only do I lead the Community Engagement Innovation Division, I also work with researchers and community members to really give an understanding of the historical perspective of the past for American Indian communities as it applies to the knowledge I know with the tribes I work with, but just, again, knowing the past of harms that research was done in tribal communities, you know, being able to understand elders' perspectives and what research was done to them and how we can move forward with younger generations and engage our tribal communities and our leadership to really see research as a benefit. So you have to have that understanding of the historical perspective and the wrongdoings that, again, just happened in our tribal communities.
I think another thing that happened in the past was there have been a lot of debates over genetically modified organisms that shaped some of the discussion today about CRISPR. We have two farmers on our panel, and I was hoping that both of you could also tell from your own perspective, how have some of the past debates, and I guess they're not even the past, they continue to this day over what's called GMOs, how is that something we need to discuss so that we can, understand the context of CRISPR?
Right, okay. Well, I'll speak as a farmer and the challenges that we faced in Zimbabwe and also representing the Southern Africa. When we talk of gene editing and the future, it seems like there is no other option for us, especially in coming from where we come from, because of climate change, which is very, very real. We see the temperatures are warming up, diseases are increasing, and farming in Zimbabwe, a lot of part of Africa is no longer viable because of the threats of pests and diseases. So the only option that is there is for us to look at how can we improve the cultivars that we have in order for us to be able to remain farming and to be able to feed the continent. So the debate is there. I think I'll speak for farmers. Farmers are very willing to embrace technology that would be able to help us to increase our yields. Obviously, there's a lot of policy debate as well in terms of what does this mean for the government. But then this, for us as farmers, would say that most farmers are willing to look at new cultivars and varieties that would make us more sustainable, make us able to feed people. Because at the end of the day, food is key on the continent. Thank you.
In my perspective, one of the things that really has affected the debate is the amount of money involved and the amount of control. And I think there's a lack of trust. We've had, instead of an actual exchange of ideas, as a debate should be, we've turned into a pitched battle of either you have one position or you have the other position. And we're actually expected by our communities and our constituencies to be on one side or the other of this, rather than actually having a more nuanced discussion. My personal opinion on the first products of biotechnology, the Roundup Ready, the herbicide-resistant crops and the pest-resistant crops, is that they are, I'm opposed to those uses of that technology because I believe they're a genetic solution to a management problem, which is a conversation that we've never had in the bigger debate.
I'd like to go back to some of these questions, but I want to, keep going so that everybody gets a chance to sort of give us their perspective. But one of the things you said that I think relates to a lot of the work that Jackie does is that there is sometimes difficulty with having nuanced debate. We don't really hear about all of the various nuances. And, Jackie, you've, in a lot of your work, you've talked about gene editing raising broader questions about the kinds of people that a society might want to have. Often with CRISPR, we'll hear designer babies, and then the conversation becomes a pitched battle over that, rather than a nuanced discussion about what we're talking about here. Could you, share with the audience some of the things you've done in your own writing and research and lived experience about these questions?
Yeah, sure. It was interesting to see that eugenics came up in such large letters in the context of fears about gene editing, because there is a lot of debate about whether what we're moving into is a kind of era which echoes the eugenics of middle of the 20th century, early 20th century. I'm not going to say very much about that. I think there are arguments in both directions there. What really is interesting for me is that when in the context of talking about gene editing around human health, human reproduction, human reproductive choice, we're potentially moving into a very different set of questions where before in thinking around things like prenatal testing and the option of termination of pregnancy, or pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, and the decision about which embryos to transfer, and so on. We were always thinking in terms of kind of a balance. We were looking at the potential impairment, disability, disease, or whatever, and effectively trying to judge, is the severity of this bad enough that it's going to warrant whatever you think of as being the moral seriousness of termination of pregnancy or selection of an embryo. People have different opinions on the moral seriousness of that. So we're trying to come to a decision about where that balance lay. Potentially, when you're looking at gene editing, you're not really looking at a balance anymore, because there's no kind of countervailing moral trouble. You're looking at, if we could genetically engineer this particular lesion so that this individual ends up with what we hope will be a better quality of life, a more flourishing life, then what's to stop us doing it? So the question is no longer kind of, is this bad enough question, but what do we really think about the things that we call differences or disabilities or diseases or genetic conditions and so on. And the issue there, I think, is that there's a loss of nuance, because bioethicists like me and other people tend to sort of say disability as if it was a single thing, or disease as if it was a single thing, and it's not. And the effects, the impacts on people's quality of life and their ability to flourish is highly diverse, and the opinions of different communities with genetic conditions, genetic lesions, genetic problems, genetic characteristics are also highly diverse. So this is where we come into the area of how do we incorporate all of those voices, all of those different perspectives into what the reports on human gene editing tend to refer to as a broad societal consensus, but tend not to tell us exactly how it is we're going to achieve that thing.
Kent, I think this relates also to some of the work that you've done. You've also been, someone at the forefront of saying that conservationists need to pay attention to questions raised by scientists. Scientists should pay attention to questions raised by conservationists. Could you share a little bit with us about some of the questions that are getting raised in the community that you're involved in?
Yes, certainly. So I don't know how many people here have seen Rampage, the film, which was just released last month with The Rock, in which CRISPR drops due to an accident from the sky and takes an albino gorilla and turns it into a rampaging monster. So it's interesting.
Very realistic.
Right. It's interesting that there's a sort of movement of laughter, and yet it's the storytelling in those movies and presaged by books by Margaret Atwood, Oryx and Crake, or even earlier by Frankenstein. These are the stories that have influenced the opinions people have when I've engaged in conversations with them about the potential use of CRISPR and other synthetic biology tools for conservation purposes. And it's a very serious issue in that the things that have their origins in fiction then are influencing the way that science is actually going to be accepted or rejected by different societies at large. So in these conversations where we've been having, we've been trying to talk to both the scientists, the people such as those in the room who are working on these tools, and the conservation community, which tends to be anti-technology, with some very important selective exceptions, and to try to get us from the conservation community to talk to you, the scientists, about potential ways not only that tools could be developed that would help intractable problems on the conservation side, but also to think very carefully about potential environmental implications of the deployment of some of the tools that are actually being discussed. With apologies to Amy, but the journalists have swarmed on these ideas about de-extinction, to bring back mammoths and what have you. And yet that is a tiny, tiny fraction of the front along which the conversation needs to take place. And that's why it's such a pleasure to be here and learn from all of you.
You know, you touch on something very important, Kent, both in, I think, journalism and even in fiction, as you mentioned. I think that often fiction and movies and popular culture, they tap into our unspoken fears. They tap into the kinds of conversations that we have, you know, with our families and with our friends around the kitchen table. And so even if they don't, in fiction, accurately present the details, I think that they try to capture the feelings that people have. So in light of that, you know, how do you suggest that information be presented in a way so that people can really understand it and engage? You know, what ways are you working on it in terms of the conservation message, for instance? And then I think everyone on the panel might have some thoughts on that broader question.
Well, I had to start out by trying to understand it myself. And it's a long time ago that I took genetics. And it was from a Marxist professor who declared that you either were going to get a B or fail. And he would brook no exceptions. So I would have gotten a D, but I got a B because I wasn't failing. But that's kind of the point of how do we have to start? Do we really have to start with base pairs? Because if you do, you're going to lose. I mean, most of my colleagues are trained in sciences, and they do not want to hear about base pairs. So how can you, in fact, begin with something that is incredibly technical and yet has implications that are about the survival of non-human life on Earth? How can we span that gap? And I think we have to do it by storytelling. And the stories need to come, or the information for the stories needs to come from people such as yourselves. But I don't think you're probably very good storytellers. So we have to find, it's a great book by a former graduate student colleague called Stop Being Such a Scientist. And it's because we're bad storytellers by and large, and yet we need ways of telling stories that are rooted in the science to be able to get people informed enough so they can make decisions about the future of the natural world.
Mm-hmm. Melissa, are people, you know, telling stories? You know, how do the elders tell the stories? How do the young people tell the stories when we're talking about scientific advances?
Yeah, I mean, the light bulb just went off when you talk about storytellers, because we think about researchers coming in, our scientists, and, you know, they're experts in their field, but also having that perspective and that conversation to know that our tribal members, our tribal leaders, they're the experts in their community. They carry that knowledge and that history and that understanding. So being able to have a conversation and not just wanting to come in and be the know-all, but building that relationship over time. So I think, again, there's storytellers everywhere on both ends, but knowing that at the end of the day that the science you're bringing in or the research is going to benefit the community, and that you're going to learn from them as well when you leave. So really focusing in on everyone as a storyteller.
Roramisu, when we talked, you know, before, you talked about particular, you know, groups of people that you thought might become the storytellers, I guess, to adopt the word, who could to speak about the experiences of farmers, to convey messages, because you felt that the information that people were receiving in your country was being dominated, you know, by one group over another. Can you talk a little bit about that in the context of that we're all storytellers, essentially?
No, absolutely. Well, I definitely agree there isn't enough information on the scientific evidence, and in a format that's easy for people to understand and digest, which is a really, really big problem. There's that big gap. So it's left for speculation and for whatever anyone wants to write on Google or wherever they're sharing information. So because of that, people don't actually have any idea. Because I remember just having a simple conversation with some farmers really deep down in the rural areas, explaining the importance of even of fortification. And people could easily understand when you speak it in their language or in a way that is that people understand the benefits and the disadvantages or whatever it is, rather than in a scientific way. So I think there is a lot of room, a really big gap for information dissemination, for people to actually understand what the future looks like and where we currently are and what will happen if we do that or if we do this. So I think, yeah, that is definitely a really, really big gap that still needs to be worked on.
And Claus, you had talked to me about how hard it is actually to bridge that gap, because even you yourself, you're immersed in all of this. You know, you understand all of this. You told me that you're not even sure yourself sometimes how much you understand and how well you understand it. So could you talk about that? I mean, that's
I think one of the occupational hazards of being a scientist is that we know more and more in extreme detail about less and less, and we tend to become siloed. And I find myself in the role of being a translator or interpreter sometimes, going to university meetings, learning about the cutting edge research, and then trying to take it back to the farmers at farmer meetings and to explain to them, why should you be excited about this? Or why should you be concerned about this? And the discussion of the story, I think, is really important. If we go back to the early 1800s, the German playwright Goethe criticized the scientific method. And I don't think we ever took him seriously enough, because he said what we're doing with single factor analysis is we're in great detail examining what happens when you change this factor, measuring one outcome. And he said you were missing the vast majority of your results from each experiment because you're only looking at one. And in my perspective, what we're seeing, and this is what the Soil Health Institute somewhat grew out of, is that we've become very good at increasing production, but we're not noticing that in the process of increasing production, we may be harming the ecosystem that the production is built on.
You know, I really keep returning to, showing my own implicit bias here, I keep returning to storytelling. But Jackie, this came up and also in our conversation, it sort of builds on what everyone here is saying. When it comes to disability, I think that many of the stories that we never hear is that people with disabilities feel that their lives are great. They're living good lives. And so I think that doesn't come up enough in conversations about when we might want to use gene editing in terms of health. Could you share some of the stories that you hear and that you tell yourself with our audience on that topic?
People with disabilities are hugely diverse, and there are some who have conditions and disabilities which clearly infringe their quality of life, and they would not be saying that they're experiencing a good life. But I think those people without disabilities have a tendency to see the more negative side. And there's quite a lot of empirical evidence around what's called the central disability paradox, which is where if you ask people to gauge quality of life of people who don't have disabilities, to gauge the quality of life of some people with disabilities, they will tend to rate it as quite low. And people with those same disabilities will tend to rate it as being as good as, or sometimes even better than, the quality of life of people without disabilities. And you can always kind of explain that away by saying, well, they would say that, wouldn't they, because they've been handed a really bad deal here and they're doing something to try to make it not so bad. Which is, I think, a fairly patronizing and arrogant way to talk about somebody's report of their lived experience that you yourself haven't had. So I think we do need to hear more of the stories which are saying, it's really not so bad, or it's a predicament, as my colleague Tom Shakespeare tends to refer to it. It's a predicament, but it's a get-roundable one. And we need to think about some of the costs, the opportunity costs, in various kinds of ways, of what it would mean not to have those experiences around. I mean, there are certainly those conditions which nobody would want people to experience or their families to experience, but we need to be, I think, a little bit more open-minded and to have more nuanced stories, because the films that we see, the books that we read, tend to be fairly to follow the kind of tragic arc of disability stories. And most of the people that I meet with and work with, and I myself, will say, yeah, it's a bit difficult sometimes, but it's certainly not tragic. The problem is that on the whole, we tend to be so busy living our lives that we're not going out there making films and writing novels and so on about how these things are. So we need to make, I think the rest of us need to make a bit of an effort to seek out some of those alternatives.
Can I?
Of course, yes, please.
So following a trail that Jackie just laid down about tragic stories, I'd like to speak about my community, which tells largely only tragic stories. In case you hadn't noticed, it's the sixth extinction. You know what I mean? And the stories that come out of the conservation world almost are always negative. And humans feature as the villains in virtually all of those stories. And the extraordinary opportunity, and it's just an opportunity that CRISPR and synthetic biology pose, is to be able to write some positive stories about the conservation world. And it doesn't turn me into a techno-optimist necessarily, but against this drumbeat of negativity, it's really important that we be able to find some things that have the potential for hope and be able to talk about that. And this, I think, in my experience, is particularly important for the younger people in the audience and otherwise, because I have been to my share of conservation meetings where there has been an elder who has told the story of the family, which is the tragedy and the destruction of the world. And you walk behind these younger people leaving the meeting, and they're just cosmically depressed and don't see why they should continue in this. So the sparks of hope for the younger folks entering this world, I think, are particularly important as places to seek honest stories and tell them if they're true.
Mm-hmm. I know you're looking at me.
You know,
going with it, yes. So thinking about the hope, and a lot of the work I've been doing in the last few years is, not focusing on the bad research or the bad outcomes or the data, but how can you strengths-based research? How can you present what, you're researching might have negative outcomes, but what is the strength and where are those gaps in between that has positive outcomes so that our tribal communities can thrive and they see what good is happening in there versus just always seeing the negative. So just going along with that.
When we first talked, you gave a specific example of how that had happened in your community. Can you, I think, so for people that can understand, because, certainly as a journalist, I think that it's rare that I have a story that doesn't have both positive and negative. Mm-hmm. So when people start talking about, we need positive stories, I guess I instinctively get nervous that won't be real. That we won't be giving people a full picture because no story is ever fully positive or fully negative. Mm-hmm. So could you explain that example that we had talked about?
Yeah, so I work with 5 tribal communities to build research infrastructure, so really helping them build capacity. And within those 5 communities, we really want to help them build up their research priorities. And so one of our tribal communities has a really good established research review board, so building that up and being able to have a say in the research that comes in and out and approving and having changes to their protocols and being the drivers. But, one of the researchers came back with the data and it was just so not good. It was not the best outcome, and the research would have done nothing for the community, I think, because it was on suicide. And so knowing that suicide is an issue, I think, across the country and not just within some of our tribal communities, but our tribes are aware that there is an issue. And so the research review board and the research coordinator had decided that data was not going to go back to the community because there was no benefit. So I think when you and I had conversated and you had asked that, is it kind of a lie to the community? And so I've been thinking about that, and it wasn't that they were withholding the truth or not giving it back. I think that the community is aware of it, and it's one of their research priorities. So being able to know that we don't want this information back out there because they're aware of it already was kind of how we kind of interpreted it and took it away. But so really being able to focus on, was there anything beneficial in that negative data that you had found on this tribal community?
That they could build on.
Yes.
And I think we all carry an unacknowledged bias. Like in your example, people who have different abilities would assume that mine are good and yours must be miserable. And that's without actually saying it. It's very hard to come out and recognize what are our biases. And in putting this into biology, I go to quite a few meetings where someone wants to have me tell them, well, I want a scale that'll give soil health 0 to 100. And I want the healthiest soil that I possibly can. And I have to push back on that, because what would be a healthy soil for bananas could be a very unhealthy soil for corn. Every species has a set of biological conditions that favor that species. And it's not that one set of conditions is good versus the other one is bad. It's whether the species that are there are in an appropriate environment for themselves. And I think we tend to have this, and we get this when we're siloed as researchers, where we're going in such a narrow direction, we don't realize that what is a negative effect in one field might actually be a positive effect in another, and we lose the nuance. And it becomes a value judgment instead of an observation.
Yeah, Jackie.
I just remembered, I mean, we've been talking about the sort of information gap between with very technical, very complex science and most people, in inverted commas, who are not particularly skilled at understanding that science. But if we're really talking about a conversation, then I think we also need to be aware that the scientists, the researchers, the policymakers and the funders tend also to be fairly ill-equipped at understanding some of the things that they're being told as well from the communities that the kind of communities that we're talking about here, at understanding what they're being told and understanding the context out of which that's coming, and trying to interpret what they're being told. And I feel on reasonably secure ground saying this because of having been a scientist myself, it can be very, very difficult to have your particular worldview and take on things challenged or at least disturbed by somebody who, in the back of your mind, you're thinking, they don't really understand this. And it takes a lot of self-discipline to tell yourself, I don't really understand what they're saying to me either. Yeah. And then I think once we can start doing that, then that's the start of a genuine conversation rather than that kind of polarized throwing opinions at each other that you mentioned.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I've been wondering a lot about whether or not we need to be basing our stories on the science. And as someone trained as a scientist, it's a heretical thing to say, but if you think about the kinds of concepts that we manage all the time in our lives, like love and hate and jealousy and money, I don't think most of us could provide a good definition or even be able to explain it very well, and yet we lead our lives interwoven with making decisions about those things. So I just wonder whether or not we have to start every conversation with base pairs, which is the way everybody wants to start a conversation. Well, you know, DNA starts. You know, maybe that's the wrong way entirely. Maybe this whole topic needs to be approached from a completely different sphere of influence. It's just that maybe we don't know how to tell that story. Well, you do, because she's a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. She can tell the story, but I can't tell the story because I always want to start with base pairs, and nobody wants to listen to a story that starts about base pairs, at least none of the people who I'm trying to talk to.
Right, yeah.
Ramisu, well, what are some of the questions you think, what are some of the questions you have, and what are some of the questions you think we need to be asking?
Well, for starters, I would say that just by listening through this conversation, what I've noticed is that a lot of the times there are different groupings that focus on different things. I think that's where it becomes sort of like a broken cycle. So some of the questions that we probably should be asking is, do we have everyone who is affected by this in the room to actually give their input? Because a lot of the times when you segment different groups, to say scientists, people, academics, and these people in different places, we sort of don't totally get the whole picture and be able to then make a decision and properly formed, and then distribute information based on that information, on that. So some of the questions we should be asking is everyone affected? Who would possibly be affected by this technology? Are they on the table? Can they give their input? How would this affect them? And what does that mean? And then when we start valuing different opinions from all parts of the world, because this is the planet we're talking about, all parts of the world, all demographics, then we can start looking at a proper solution in terms of what the information dissemination should be looking like for the future and how we can move from here.
Who do you want to see at the table that you think doesn't have a seat, or maybe has a seat but not enough seats?
More farmers, definitely. I've only been to, I think, 2 conferences on this topic, yet this is full-time what I'm doing. This affects me fully, completely. And I'm fortunate enough to have gone to 2, but most of the other people have never attended any of these. A lot of people who are working on even developing traditional cultivars, they're not on the table. They might not even have as much information that we have here. So definitely more people in marginalized communities need to be on the table and understand more on this and be able to give their input as well.
You know, I think actually I'd like maybe all of the people on the panel, like, who's missing at the table? Who do you want to see at the table that isn't yet represented?
As one example, and I don't know how we bring them to the table, is future generations. Because how we're affected in a very short term, modern agriculture has been a relatively recent event in history. And there's a book that I would recommend anyone to read for perspective, Farmers for 40 Centuries, about farming systems that were stable and produced healthy, good yields of food for that long. I really think farmers, while they need to be at the table, have a tendency to ask very short-term, nearsighted questions. Not that they're the wrong questions, but they might not be all the questions that need to be asked. Yeah. I'd like to expand the table to have somebody come in who could be a facilitator and force us to ask broader reaching questions, the right questions. And actually the soil health movement started with that. We had a group of farmers in New York who saw their vegetable yields declining. And no matter how good the new pesticides were, with apologies to our biotech companies, or how good the new seeds were, the yields were falling. And there was a brilliant lady who was an extension agent. She'll never get credit, but she was listening to what the farmers were saying. And she started asking questions that led to the research that showed we had declining soil health. And up to a point, the pesticides and crop protectants were helping. Beyond that point, the foundation that our food system was built on was crumbling so that you could no longer Band-Aid it to have it work. And we can't ask that kind of a question unless we really expand the table and expand the topic beyond the comfort zone of the people who are directly involved.
Jackie, if we expand the table, as I think many people feel we should, does the table ever get so large that we can't reach any sort of consensus? As someone who's a bioethicist and probably thinks about that a lot, I'd love to hear your views on that as well. You know, should there be more people at the table? And then how do we ever reach consensus if we have millions and millions of people at the table?
Millions and millions of people will never reach a consensus. I think we also may never reach something that's really a consensus because I think, what we will come out with in the end will probably, if it is a true consensus, be something that fails to satisfy 100% virtually everybody. Virtually everybody is going to feel dissatisfied with the final outcome of whatever sort of regulatory framework we come out with. In order to get some more voices of more than the usual suspects at the table, the farmers, people with various kinds of disabilities, people from other kinds of marginalised communities, faith groups, economically marginalised people who may have very different priorities than CRISPR. In order to get them to the table, we need a huge amount of investment. And people don't like to talk, policymakers and governments don't like to talk about this kind, putting money into this kind of thing. So we need to talk about resourcing those sorts of conversations, skilling people in order to do them, and so on. But particularly in terms of who I would like to see as part of these discussions are the kind of people who can ask the sort of why rather than how questions, because we've already moved, I think, very, very rapidly into the state of asking, how are we going to use this? How are we going to regulate this? How are we going to do it justly, responsibly, etc.? And those are very, very important questions. But we very quickly skipped over, as I think culturally we tend to do with new technology. Why are we using this?
Yeah.
Not, well, maybe we shouldn't use it, but say, what is the point? What are we trying to achieve with it? And I think there are more people who can ask those sorts of questions that give us a different perspective, which might kind of pull us back a little bit from the almost panicky, we've got to get a regulatory framework around this so that we can do X, Y, Z with it. But to say, oh, well, okay, there may be domains in which the thing that we're trying to achieve, the why, is better achieved or better served by some other means. And there are some domains where this is actually really the right thing to be using to achieve that final goal. But I don't think we're very clear about that yet.
Right.
Yes.
So my position, my constituency isn't even mentioned, right? All this language is who's at the table. Class said soil, so we want soil at the table. But we also want all the other species that live on the face of the earth. So everybody talked about the people that need to be at the table. That's the problem, is you're going to talk to people about what people want, and then people are going to respond about what people want. And meanwhile, everything else out there that's going to be impacted by these technologies is left mute. So the true voiceless are the ones who need to be at the table, or figure out how you can represent them of all of their different stripes and sizes and colors in having these discussions.
Oh, that is a great point. I mean, do you have ideas? Like, I think, it would be interesting, all of you are working in this area, not just on raising the questions, but even coming up with some ways to not solve it, but at least get some rich discussions going. How can we represent not just people? I think that's a great point, but all we share this earth with. Is there, Melissa, you have?
Yeah, so kind of combining both of them and thinking about who's at the table, because as I look around the room, I'm like, am I the only American Indian in the room? And so being one, grateful that I'm here for this opportunity and being able to represent as best I can, not every American Indian, because there's over 567 tribes in the US, but being able to have one perspective, but also knowing that part of my job is to know, like, who can we engage with in the community? Who can I reach out to? But it's going to their table at the other end. So not just always saying, come to this meeting, be here at this time. Like, we won't get those people because they're so busy. So go to their table, go to their meeting, go to their, whatever they have going on, whether it's cultural, historical, education, political. So
Good.
About that.
I think we need to document more things that are happening, more information, so that we can share around, and people don't necessarily sometimes have to travel, because I think it's a little bit difficult for everyone to travel to see what's happening to the sea, what's happening to this, what's happening to that. But being able to document information so that people can share, document lives, document how this has changed that and how this has helped that, and then when we have all this information in a way that is organized so that it's not all over the place, then maybe we can be better informed as well and be able to represent or talk about a topic that, even though we haven't seen it, but we have sort of virtually seen it, because these days with technology.
So CRISPR wikis.
Yes.
I'm going to share a short story about a way that my perspective was challenged. And that's, I consult some on farms because we've been very successful at growing organic crops. And one of our consulting jobs was for a man who used to shake Wall Street. And I learned more from him than he learned from me. And he stopped me partway through the consultation and he said, wait a minute, you're never going to give me the right answer if you can't frame the right question. And he kind of shut off everything that I had planned to tell him how this is all going to work great and put me in, and he said, now, why are you trying to, and I'm going to use a simple example, but you should be asking, why are you trying to kill these weeds? You should be asking, why are you trying to kill these insects? What's more, that's an overly simple question. You should be asking, why are these insects here in numbers that have unbalanced the ecosystem? And he started asking all these very uncomfortable questions that made the picture bigger. And I think we spend so much time maybe being too close to the picture. And this might be part of how do we expand, how do we include the other species? How do we include the things that we're not thinking about, just by forcing ourselves to step back and question, are our research priorities correct? Are they complete? Are there research priorities that nobody thought of that need to be added to the discussion?
I think that's such a great point. You know, one of the things I've often wondered about is what happens when we eventually get to a point where we just can't compromise. It's one of our essential core values, and you know, we refuse to, you know, go any further in the interest of consensus in society. So what do we do then? Melissa, you raised this issue with me. You told me that there are people who have a particular view about their bodies and gene editing, and that isn't going to change no matter how much information you provide. So what happens then?
That, I don't want to say I don't know, but I think it goes down to, again, how is that going to benefit the community or the future? And again, you have to be respectful of that individual, but I think as tribes operate in a community sense, you have to be able to have a conversation and bring in the community perspectives and the individual at the same time. And I think we're still working on that and trying to find that perfect way. So it's hard to really know the right answer or give the right answer.
Yeah. And trying to just figure out ways to ask more questions, I guess, frame the questions. I want to allow the audience to ask their own questions. I think that they probably have a few. So let's see, how are we going to do this? I'm waiting for.
Yeah, no worries. You're the first round. So you can see them, and I think we're noticing in the very first question you've spent some time answering just now. So we'll use your discretion as to which ones you want to focus in on.
Yeah, no, I mean, wow, these are terrific. You guys are all great question askers. How do we ensure gene editing is affordable and not just a tool of the elite? That's a great question. I mean, it does get into this issue of access. You know, I'd like to hear also, Ramisa, what do you think about that? Because does the United States have an obligation to make its science and technology available to other countries that may not have the same kind of resources to invest in science? I mean, that might be one way of answering, you know, starting a discussion on this question.
Right. How do we make it affordable? I have no idea how you can make it affordable. I think normally with anything, if there's enough investment which can subsidize to make it affordable, then it becomes affordable. So maybe more like people buying into the social aspect of it, the benefit of it, would make it more affordable. Because there's a lot of money that actually goes into feeding people around the world. Every year, I think the increase of need for aid, people in starvation. So when we look at how can we leverage using that money in developing developing the science that will reduce the need for the food, then maybe we can find a balance of using that money for the science. Maybe then we could make it affordable.
Okay. Do you have,
You're bringing in thought that doesn't have anything to do with these questions, but it does in a sideways way. And that's when we talk about asking the right question. I think there's an assumption even in this room of the question is, how do we produce more food? Maybe the question ought to be, why do we have to produce more food? And are there things we have to deal with? Is there a carrying capacity to this planet that in order to maintain a decent standard of living or a good environment or a good quality of life, that do we need to discuss how much food do we want to produce?
and again, in order to even start talking about those questions or answering the questions, we need to engage the public. And one of the most popular questions here kind of relates to this, and I would welcome any input from the panel on this, is what does engaging the public about gene editing look like? You know, you mentioned movies, we talked about fiction, we talked about journalism, but are there ways of engaging the public that we haven't thought about and that might be maybe more innovative?
So I think children are being raised to think about these things in ways that we don't understand. So I think maybe the public is already being engaged. For those of you in the elitist category who read the New York Times, there was a children's science section. The first one that was ever put out was in November of last year. And in the interior portion of this section of the newspaper was an article that said, DNA is everywhere, it's time to get out your scissors and play. So this was being written for children. So I think we're already going to be looking at younger people who are coming up the way my children were raised with cell phones. It's just a natural part of their life. So we may have a generational issue here that we think that it may be the wrong question that's being asked.
Yeah, good point. I think this, oh, I'm sorry, Jackie, go ahead.
I think that's a very interesting parallel, and it speaks to the way in which the technologies that we have and the way that we talk about them, whether or not they kind of pan out, or whether or not they pan out in the way that we think they will, or that we hope they will, can also just change the way that people think. They can change a cultural atmosphere, and they can change the cultural assumptions. And just as I think when we kind of went into the sort of smartphone era, at least some of us are old enough to remember back then, most of us didn't imagine what some of the baseline assumptions of the current generation were going to be. Like me seeing all my students no longer wearing watches because they check their time on their phones, and they no longer write down appointments because they just kind of navigate towards each other with their phones. I don't think we kind of pictured that, and it's changed the way in which people think about interactions. And similarly, one of the concerns I think we share around these technologies is not even whether they'll be implemented in a way which will end up being labeled as eugenic or being overtly eugenic, but just whether their availability and the routinization of assuming that they will be used and that they'll be used in particular ways create public expectations, social expectations that that's how we're going to use them, and those are the kind of people that we don't need to have around, and why did you choose in that case to have that kind of child, and so on. So I think we need to be very careful both about whether or not the technology is working and also what it's doing just to the way that we're framing some of the baseline assumptions even before we get to the questions.
Okay, I think this one is for you. Does CRISPR have a role in organic ag?
That's, I can have an opinion, but I can't speak for the entire constituency.
Of course.
My opinion is that CRISPR, like all biotechnology, is a very powerful tool. A tool is neutral. It's not good, it's not bad, but it extends the capacity and the capability of the people, whoever wields it. I think there are some uses of CRISPR that would be fully compatible, in my opinion, with the goals of organic agriculture. There are some others that I think would not be compatible, and I would hope that as an industry we could go forward and discuss the different uses and just make that distinction based on how the technology is being used as opposed to which technology was used.
Do you use the technology on your farm?
Because we're certified organic, we do not. And that actually brings up another interesting conversation. And we were not allowed to use, obviously, synthetic fertilizers, although we could use natural ones. We're not allowed to use pesticides. We're not allowed to use antibiotics. This is under national NOP rules. Because we were not allowed to, we were forced to learn techniques that nobody ever thought possible. We can point to farms that have less cell count, less disease, less infection because they use no antibiotics, because they found different techniques that were more effective than antibiotics. We now have ways of controlling soil diseases and weeds that I feel are much more elegant and much more effective than herbicides, because we had the discipline of taking that away from us. So personally, I think it's been healthy to, just for the diversity of techniques. And also that brings out the idea of when the only tool you've got is a hammer, every problem turns into a nail. I think we sometimes will take a technology like CRISPR and try to use it to fix everything instead of asking, what is this most appropriate for? And is this the most appropriate way to deal with this problem, or is there some other route that nobody is thinking about that may be much more effective in the long run?
Oh, that's a great point. Do you envision that gene editing will exacerbate current global inequalities?
I believe it could, and again, it depends on how it's used. You know, if it were used to concentrate farming in larger and larger units, if it were used as a part of a system of integration where the food system becomes controlled at more levels, but that doesn't mean it has to be used that way. So again, it becomes a tool that could make something possible, but it's not the nature of the tool. It's who uses it and for what purpose.
Yeah. Okay. I think this one was related to something you said, which is that how do we make science more engaging than Frankenstein and monsters?
Well, you can't. I mean, there's a reason that the story of Frankenstein has, you know, archetypal roots in many cultures and will continue to have. So you don't fight it, you join it, right? We need to create a Disney film that's about CRISPR called, you know, Finding CRISPR, or
Instead of Rampage?
yeah,
Maybe that's not the best title.
And the challenge is to create something as compelling as, forget what they're called, those little funny things that don't speak that run around in the movies that look like, what are they called? They're sort of minions, that's what they are.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, you could, you know, start to think the way about people who write stories. We can do it. You guys can do it. It's absolutely there, but learn why Frankenstein is important, and then make a story that follows those sorts of roles. There's a fabulous book called Humans as Storytelling Animals, and the author leads by saying the most powerful thing you can do to quiet an audience is to say, "Once upon a time." Mm-hmm. It stops almost all conversations. We want to hear the story, so we got to tell them a story.
So once upon a time, there was a great panel at CRISPRcon, and we've reached the end of our time, but not the end of the story. So I want to thank everyone on this panel, and thank you for sharing your stories, and I hope that we'll all continue to talk with each other. Thank you.